In 2023, the average CEO of a top US company earned 400 times more than the average worker. In 1965, so around 60 years ago, the ratio was just 20 to 1. Furthermore, the Economic Policy Institute reported that CEO compensation had grown by 1,322% since 1978, while the typical worker's compensation only grew by 18% during that same period. These are big numbers, and I'll say it again, 400 times the average worker's compensation. And of course, people have noticed that, raising the question if CEOs deserve this exorbitant pay or not, especially at the expense of workers, which, as we've seen, have only seen a mediocre, at best, increase in pay. And no, this is not a video thrashing CEOs or rich people and saying all rich people suck and all rich people are bad. Rather, I want to find out if there's actually truth to both sides of the argument. On one side, there's the case for higher CEO compensation. Most people on this side say that CEO pay is mostly performance-based. A substantial portion of CEO pay is tied directly to company performance, often in the form of stock options, bonuses, and other incentives that align their interests with shareholders. For those of us who don't know who stock options are, they're essentially a way of tying the CEO's compensation to the stock price performance. You get assigned a certain portion of stocks at a certain price, let's say $100. Now, if you're the CEO, you're responsible for the company's performance. If the company performs well, your stock might be worth $150 or even $200, giving you a significant increase in compensation. On the other hand, if the stock doesn't perform well, you're going to lose a large part of your compensation. For example, Elon Musk has famously structured his compensation at Tesla in such a way that he earns nothing in base salary pretty much, but stands to gain billions if Tesla meets specific performance targets. And because of this, in 2022, he was awarded $6.7 billion in stock options. It reflected Tesla's success in the EV market, in particular with its stock price, increasing multiple hundreds of percent from 2020 to 2022. We also have other CEOs that have completely turned around failing companies, like Satya Nadella of Microsoft. When he took over the company in 2014, they were losing ground to competitors like Google in search, cloud, and also Apple in hardware. But by focusing on cloud computing and embracing new technology, he transformed Microsoft, doubling its market cap to over $2 trillion in 2021. His compensation reached $50 million in 2021, reflecting the company's skyrocketing performance. He created basically $1 trillion in value and only, quote unquote, I say this with a big caveat, got $50 million as reward for that huge increase in market cap. So we can see that CEO pay in fact is linked to performance. Or is it? Critics of high CEO pay said there's a questionable link between CEO pay and performance. Despite high compensation packages often being tied to performance metrics, there are many instances where CEOs continue to receive substantial pay even when the company's performance is poor. For example, many CEOs receive substantial severance packages, which is essentially they're being kicked out or fired from their company, regardless of their performance. Marissa Mayer, the CEO of Yahoo, received a $23 million exit package despite the company's struggling performance and declining stock value during her tenure. And one of the biggest case studies here is WeWork. Adam Newman, who also has a show now based on his life and work at WeWork, received a $1.7 billion payout when he was ousted from the company, literally kicked out from the company in 2019. Despite leading the company through a failed IPO and significant drop in valuation, his compensation highlighted issues with the alignment of pay and performance. Another famous example from Yahoo is Carol Bartz, former CEO who was terminated in 2021, once again kicked out, and received a $10 million severance package. Her tenure saw a decline in Yahoo's market share and financial performance, raising questions about the fairness of her compensation relative to company outcomes. These are just 3 examples we've talked about. There's dozens, even hundreds of examples out there where CEOs have not performed to the level that they're expected, but still receive millions of dollars in termination packages or salary payouts. Before we dig deeper, if you are enjoying this video, please smash the like button and the subscribe button if you enjoy learning more about money, how to make more or save more, or just understand it better. Now, here, people that argue for high CEO compensation highlight the responsibility and risk that comes with being a CEO. This perhaps is one of the strongest arguments for CEO CEO compensation, there's immense responsibility and pressure that CEOs take on. They're tasked with overseeing the entire company, making decisions that can affect the livelihoods of thousands of employees, shareholders, and sometimes even the broader economy with these bigger companies. They have to set the company's strategic vision, decide on mergers and acquisitions, and handle crises and ensure long-term growth. Some of these decisions are extremely controversial, and they have to take responsibility for it. Whether it's entering a new market or deciding to innovate or scale back, the weight of these decisions falls directly on them. For example, when the CEO of General Motors, Mary Barra, decided to pivot the company towards electric vehicles, it represented a monumental shift with enormous financial and even operational implications. Here, once again, we might have to look at the broader picture though. Sure, the CEO decides the vision and the strategy of where the company is headed, but what about the implementation? There's a glaring disparity between CEO pay and the wages of average workers, the people who are actually implementing the vision. Of course, if you decide, well, I need to change my factory's production from diesel cars to now EVs, there's people who actually have to implement those changes and actually make the cars, sell them, and make sure that the technology is working. These are all workers that actually implement the vision, and a lot of people argue the implementation should be valued way more than it currently is. This pay gap between CEOs and workers has grown steadily, leading to a question about fairness and the justification for such high salaries. But why is there this wealth disparity? The S&P 500 is the stock market index tracking the 500 biggest companies in the United States. The CEO of these companies earned 400 times more than the median worker. That is okay. The CEO earns more because they have more strategic input and more risk taken on than the average worker. But this number is up from 20 times in 1965. This signals a widening gap that is more stark compared to other countries, where the CEO to worker pay ratio is much lower. And a lot of people argue this signals that rich people have found a way to make sure that most of the value generated in the economy stays in the hands of the rich instead of being passed on to the average worker. On the surface, you might say, hey, that's just capitalism, baby. What are you going to do about it? But research has shown that companies with more equitable pay structures tend to have higher employee satisfaction and productivity. For instance, in 2019, a study by the Harvard Business Review found that organizations with smaller CEO to worker pay ratios experience 25% higher employee engagement and 20% lower turnover rates. One of the most famous examples is Costco, where the CEO to worker pay ratio is much lower than other firms. They often report higher levels of employee satisfaction and lower turnover. Costco's CEO to worker pay ratio is about 20 to 1 compared to the average 400 to 1 in other S&P 500 companies. Now, a counterpoint here is that you cannot really have success without innovative leadership. I know we're going back and forward here, but some CEOs, people argue, bring transformative innovation that reshapes entire industries and not just the company, justifying their pay through long-term growth and global impact. Steve Jobs, who can forget our guy Steve Jobs, that made Apple one of the most valuable companies in the world. His innovative thinking, marketing tactics led to the creation of revolutionary products like the iPhone, which transformed not only the company, but also the way people live and communicate. If you think about it, some of the features that were popularized in the iPhone, like the pins to increase the size of your photos, getting mail on your phone, a lot of these things are still widely used in cell phones today. At the time of his passing, Apple's market value had increased from $5 billion to $350 billion in his tenure alone. Another one of our friends, Jeff Bezos, at Amazon. He turned Amazon from an online bookstore into a global e-commerce and technology giant, pushing into sectors like cloud computing and AI. He earns primarily through stock compensation and in 2021 earned $1.7 billion. Not just Jobs and Bezos, but other CEOs provide innovation that directs companies that the average employee simply perhaps does not have. So even if they're implementing things and making sure that the product gets delivered, what product to innovate on and what product to deliver is ultimately the decision of the CEO and can make or break a company. Of course, this is once again in an idealistic world. In reality though, a lot of CEOs might focus disproportionately on stock compensation, leading to short-term thinking. Like we talked about, a lot of CEO compensation is tied to the stock market, for better or for worse. And critics argue that excessive bonuses and stock buybacks are often detrimental to the company's long-term growth, particularly stock buybacks. Companies often engage in stock buybacks to boost stock prices and consequently the value of stock options granted to CEOs. A stock buyback is essentially when a company buys its own stock from the stock market, decreasing the amount of stock available to the general public. So if a company has 100 shares, for the sake of an example, and buys back 50 shares, now there's only 50 shares in the market that the general public can can avail. This could boost the price of the company's stock, leading to an increase in CEO compensation. And these stock buyback amounts are not tiny. In 2019, Apple spent $70 billion on stock buybacks, which specifically only helps people with a large amount of stock in the company. These funds could have been used for employee raises, innovation, or other investments that benefit the broader workforce. For example, an increased dental plan or an increased healthcare plan in the United States. But this was sacrificed for appeasing the shareholders and also appeasing the CEO and other C-level executives with a high stock compensation. And there's been numerous instances where CEOs have preferred short-term gains in the stock price because that is what they're expected to deliver by the board of directors and other people holding a lot of voting power in the company. A famous example is General Electric's former CEO, Jeff Immelt. He prioritized short-term stock gains over the company's long-term strategy by implementing short-sighted initiatives, leading to a dramatic decline in GE's market value and an eventual need for restructuring. And once again, this restructuring is impacting normal average employees, not the CEO and not the C-level executives. And I guess at the end of the day, maybe a slightly weaker argument is that companies need to attract top talent. CEO pay is already high, we understand that. But to attract and retain the best leadership, companies need to offer competitive compensation. It's as simple as that. Just like top athletes or actors can get high salaries because they have rare skills that are very, very sought after, top tier CEOs and executives that have a track record of profitability, innovation, and even, for example, long-term survival can also garner the same compensation. For example, when Google was looking for a CEO, ultimately deciding on Sundar Pichai, Sundar had other offers from Microsoft and other companies because they were interested in his deep tech expertise, particularly with cloud computing, a field that was booming at that time. Ultimately, they compensated him with $280 million in stock grants in 2019 because that is simply what it took to retain his talent. There's also other industries where perhaps leadership matters more. For example, healthcare or finance. There's rapidly changing regulatory environments, and high quality leadership is extremely essential. And a lot of the times, especially in healthcare, these companies live and die by their CEO's decisions. Now, no matter if you believe that CEOs actually deserve that 400-to-1 ratio, we do have to talk about that issue of wealth inequality. From an absolute perspective, the top 1% earns significantly more than the rest of the population. But as we've seen, the growth has way outpaced an average worker's wage. And this has a significant impact on worker morale and productivity. When employees see these significant pay disparities, it can lead to decreased morale and productivity. A 2020 survey by Glassdoor found that 60% of employees felt demotivated by large pay gaps, leading to lower job satisfaction and, this is the most important part, lower engagement and productivity. And it's not just employees, but the public has also started to notice that. Public opinion on CEO compensation has shifted significantly in recent years, reflecting growing concerns about income inequality and fairness in pay. A 2023 Gallup poll found that 70% of Americans believe that CEO pay is too high. This is the flag bearer of capitalism, by the way, the US of A, baby. 70% of Americans believe that CEO pay is too high, with many questioning the fairness and justification of such salaries. One of the most important factors in this is social media. Social media platforms have amplified calls for accountability, with hashtags like fair pay, CEO excess, trending in response to news reports on CEO compensation. Also, the average workers share their experience on these platforms, on how they're treated, how they're compensated, and websites in all industries now track worker compensation, reflecting the wealth disparity between a CEO and average worker. For example, websites like Glassdoor, Levels.fyi accurately tell you what job title earns what amount of salary at a particular company. This was just not the case before in the 1970s or 1960s, where this information was guarded by individuals as a closed secret. Recently, because of this wealth disparity, there's also been union and worker protests, strikes against high CEO compensation, and to improve pay structures and decrease income inequality have become more common. The Amazon protests in 2021, where workers at an Amazon warehouse in Bessemer, Alabama, organized a union vote partly in response to the high pay of Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, is a famous example. Most of them also allege that they're, for example, not even allowed to take a washroom break. The union vote ultimately did fail, but it drew national attention to the disparity between Bezos' wealth and the wages of Amazon warehouse workers. And I don't want to target my buddy Bezos, Walmart has also faced similar protests. Specifically in 2014, workers participated in strikes and demonstrations, criticizing the high salaries of Walmart executives compared to the low wage of employees. The movement was part of the broader 5 for $15 movement, which advocated for a $15 minimum wage. And where people talk, politicians listen because they also want to get voted in the next election. There have been calls for reform in the US Senate and the US House for reforming CEO pay. In 2021, Elizabeth Warren introduced the Accountable Capitalism Act, which aimed to impose stricter regulations on corporate governance and executive compensation. Some institutes have also talked about a billionaire's tax, particularly the Progressive Policy Institute in 2021, to target excessive earnings and address income inequality. These proposals include higher taxes on large executive compensation packages as a means to distribute wealth more fairly. Although these are once again still just proposals, and I just don't see this being implemented just because politicians are also sponsored by the same people that they're trying to now, I guess, tax more, and that just simply does not align with their incentives for most politicians. Not all of them, but most of them. Which brings me to my next point. We've mostly only talked about the United States, the US of A, my favorite country, the flag bearers of capitalism. US CEOs are amongst the highest paid in the world. The average CEO in an S&P 500 company earned about $16.7 million. But what about other countries? Other developed economies? Japanese CEO compensation is considerably lower. The average pay for a Japanese CEO is around $1 million to $2 million annually. This lower compensation is partly due to Japan's corporate culture, which traditionally emphasizes modesty and collective success over individual wealth. Additionally, Japanese companies often have a more egalitarian approach to pay and a focus on long-term stability rather than short-term gains. German CEOs also earn significantly less compared to their American counterparts. In 2022, the average German CEO earned around $1.5 million, which is about 30 times the average worker's salary. German corporate culture and labor law emphasizes fairness in cooperation between management and workers, contributing to a narrower pay gap. Additionally, Germany also has stronger regulations on executive compensation, including requirements for transparency and shareholder approval of any pay packages. And not just Japan, Germany, and the UK, a lot of countries have different corporate governance norms. For instance, in Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Norway, there's a strong tradition of worker representation on corporate boards. This influences executive pay and contributes to narrower pay gaps. Lastly, there's also public perception. In many European countries, there is greater public pressure on companies to act responsibly and share profits more equitably. Some companies have implemented the CEO to worker pay ratio model. For example, the Ben & Jerry's co-founders implemented a policy in which the CEO's salary could not exceed 5 times that of the lowest paid worker. This model promotes a more equitable pay structure. To counter focus on the short-term stock price, there's been a shift from short-term performance incentives to long-term growth metrics. Instead of basing bonuses and stock options on annual financial results, companies can tie compensation to long-term goals, such as multi-year revenue growth, sustainable targets, or shareholder value. Salesforce, for example, uses long-term performance metrics to determine a portion of its executive compensation. And since there's been a lot of talk about the stock price, a lot of companies have introduced broad-based stock ownership. Companies like Google and Starbucks offer stock options or equity grants to a broad range of employees, not just the top executives. This approach helps to align the interests of all employees with the company's long-term success and encourages a sense of shared purpose. So employee ownership is improving, but it's still a far cry from what it should be, according to critics of high CEO compensation. The argument, though, might be, why not redistribute some of this wealth to someone who's going to spend it in the economy? An example is, let's say you give a CEO an extra $1,000. Their needs have already been met. If you redistribute that and give it to the average person, they're going to spend it more so on the economy, arguably a larger percentage. This is also called the marginal propensity to consume. Although we are yet to see a solution to this problem of disparity, as long as employee partnership in the performance of the company improves, they can keep on taking part in the fruits of their labor. And a lot of people argue having millions of people getting a share of their productivity is more important than buying Jeff Bezos an extra yacht. As always, smash the like button and the subscribe button if you enjoyed this video. It really helps the channel out and helps with the YouTube algorithm. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one.